The morning of February 13th, 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh stood beside his new aircraft, running his hand along the distinctive inverted gull wing that gave the Chance Vought F4U Corsair its unmistakable silhouette. 3,000 miles to the northwest, in the operations room at Rabaul, Japanese intelligence officers were briefing Zero pilots on this new American fighter. The assessment was dismissive, almost contemptuous. The Americans had built another brute, powerful but clumsy, so flawed that their own navy had rejected it for carrier operations. It was suitable only for secondary land-based duty with the Marines. The officers smiled as they delivered their conclusion: superior Japanese training and the proven excellence of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero would overcome this latest example of American industrial excess over engineering elegance. Within 6 months, that mocked aircraft would achieve an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japan's finest pilots. The plane Tokyo Rose herself, ridiculed in propaganda broadcasts, would become known as Whistling Death, a name spoken with dread across every Japanese airfield in the Pacific. What those intelligence officers at Rabaul didn't know, what their doctrine made nearly impossible to recognize, was that they were witnessing not just another fighter aircraft, but the weapon that would shatter Japanese air supremacy and transform the nature of aerial combat itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the Corsair's transformation from rejected failure to legendary killer reveals one of the war's profound ironies. Assumptions that survive contact with one enemy may fail catastrophically against an enemy who changes the terms of engagement entirely. For 18 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation had dominated Pacific skies with tactical and psychological supremacy that seemed unbreakable. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero had established itself as the most feared fighter aircraft in the world, and Japanese pilots had earned their confidence through blood and victory. Every assumption they held about aerial combat had been validated by nearly 2 years of continuous triumph. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians and a principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had personally developed the training regimen that produced Japan's elite naval aviators. By early 1943, veteran Japanese pilots at forward bases like Rabaul, Truk, and Bougainville averaged between 650 and 800 flight hours before entering combat. This represented a training standard that American and British pilots of that period could rarely approach, let alone match. These were not merely competent aviators, they were warriors who had studied their craft with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai embodied this excellence. Already an ace with over 30 confirmed kills by mid-1943, Sakai described the Zero's advantages with the precision of an engineer dissecting a perfect machine. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. Its rate of climb exceeded anything the Allies could field. At low speeds, where dogfighting occurred, it was simply untouchable. The Zero could loop, roll, and maneuver through the sky, while American pilots struggled merely to keep it in sight. These weren't empty boasts, they were observable facts that had been demonstrated in hundreds of combat engagements. The statistics supported this confidence with cold mathematical certainty. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Zero pilots had achieved kill ratios approaching 12-to-1 against Allied fighters. During the campaign for the Dutch East Indies, Japanese naval aviation had effectively swept British and Dutch aircraft from the skies with a thoroughness that shocked Allied commanders. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Zero pilots had demonstrated their ability to engage American fighters on favorable terms, despite facing the newer Grumman F4F Wildcat, an aircraft specifically designed to counter the Zero's advantages. But this dominance rested on assumptions about fighter combat that Japanese intelligence and tactical doctrine treated as immutable laws of physics. and those assumptions were about to collide with American engineering in ways that would prove catastrophic for the Emperor's finest pilots. Japanese fighter pilots had developed extraordinarily detailed tactical knowledge of American aircraft through systematic study of captured examples and meticulous analysis of combat reports. They knew the Grumman F-4F Wildcat's strengths and critical limitations, with the intimacy of engineers who had torn the aircraft apart bolt by bolt. Intelligence briefings at Rabaul and other forward bases included specific tactical guidance refined through 2 years of combat. American fighters were heavier, faster in straight-line flight, and could absorb more battle damage before going down. But they could not turn with a zero. They could not climb with a zero at combat speeds. And American pilots, Japanese doctrine insisted with cultural certainty, lacked the warrior spirit and rigorous training discipline of Imperial Navy aviators. This analysis had proved devastatingly accurate for nearly 2 years. The tactical equation seemed settled, permanent, unchallengeable. Lieutenant Junior Grade Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would eventually become Japan's top-scoring ace with over 87 confirmed victories, had perfected tactics exploiting these American weaknesses with surgical precision. In combat reports from early 1943, Nishizawa described the standard engagement pattern with clinical detachment. The American fighters would attempt diving attacks, their only viable tactical advantage given their superior speed. Japanese pilots would execute sharp turns at the moment of attack, forcing the heavier American aircraft to overshoot. Once the Americans committed to their diving pass, they became predictable, their options constrained by physics and aircraft limitations. The heavy American fighters couldn't recover quickly enough from high-speed dives to evade the Zero's counterattack. It was geometry, physics, and training combining into a killing pattern that had claimed hundreds of Allied pilots. American pilots in Wildcats had learned through bitter experience that attempting to dogfight Zeros meant certain death. The solution they developed, the famous Thach weave, was fundamentally defensive. 2 Wildcat fighters would scissor back and forth in coordinated patterns, each covering the other's vulnerable approach angles. It was effective for survival, buying precious seconds to escape, but it was not a tactic and for achieving air superiority. It was a tactic for not dying. Zero pilots had adapted by using altitude advantage to choose precisely when to engage, breaking off whenever Americans attempted to force the combat into high-speed diving contests. The tactical balance had stabilized into a grim stalemate. Americans could survive through disciplined defensive tactics and mutual support, but Japanese fighters retained the crucial ability to disengage at will and control the fundamental terms of engagement. Japanese pilots decided when fights happened and when they didn't. That control was the essence of air superiority. By spring 1943, Japanese intelligence had begun collecting reports about a new American fighter entering service with Marine squadrons in the Solomon Islands. The initial assessments were not merely dismissive, they were contemptuous in ways that would prove tragically short-sighted. The aircraft was designated F4U, the Chance Vought Corsair. Intelligence photographs showed a distinctive inverted gull-wing design that Japanese engineers found unnecessarily complex, even bizarre. Why accept such structural complications when simpler straight-wing designs had proved perfectly adequate? The nose was exceptionally long, housing a massive 2,000 horsepower, Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine, nearly 40% more powerful than the Zero's Nakajima Sakaya engine, which produced 1,130 horsepower. But Japanese analysts identified what they considered fatal, disqualifying flaws. The long nose created severe visibility problems for pilots, particularly during the critical phases of carrier approaches and landings. The United States Navy had actually rejected the Corsair for carrier operations in early 1943, officially citing these visibility issues and the aircraft's dangerous tendency to bounce during carrier landings due to its stiff, unforgiving landing gear. Instead, the Navy had assigned Corsairs to land-based Marine squadrons, a decision that seemed to confirm every Japanese assumption about American engineering priorities. To Japanese planners studying these reports at headquarters facilities across the Pacific, this seemed like definitive confirmation of their existing beliefs. The Americans had built another powerful brute, impressively muscular but fundamentally clumsy, rejected by their own premier service, suitable only for secondary land-based operations where its deficiencies wouldn't prove fatal. It fit perfectly into the Japanese understanding of American aircraft design, philosophy overwhelming power, compensating for lack of refinement, quantity over quality, industrial capacity, masking engineering mediocrity. Captain Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer at Rabaul responsible for analyzing enemy capabilities and preparing tactical guidance, later described the prevailing attitude with remarkable candor in his post-war memoir. The Japanese aviation community learned that the American Navy had refused to accept this new fighter for carrier operations. This information reinforced the deeply held belief that while Americans could produce aircraft in vast numbers, their industrial capacity was undeniable. They had not solved the fundamental problems of carrier fighter design that Japan had mastered with the Zero. The Zero represented the pinnacle of a design philosophy, extreme maneuverability and operational range achieved through ruthless weight minimization and aerodynamic refinement. It was elegant, purposeful, nearly perfect for the mission it was designed to perform. The Corsair's combat debut in February 1943 with Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-124 at Guadalcanal had been modest, almost underwhelming. The Marines had scored their first kills, certainly, but nothing in those early engagements suggested a revolutionary aircraft that would change the nature of Pacific air combat. Japanese pilots reported the Corsair as fast, dangerously, impressively fast in level flight and dives, but this merely confirmed existing tactical doctrine that had served them well for 2 years. Avoid diving contests with American fighters, refuse to fight the enemy's preferred battle, engage instead in turning battles where Zero superiority remained decisive and overwhelming. The tactical calculus seemed clear, logical, supported by years of successful combat experience. Japanese tactical doctrine in spring 1943 treated speed as a secondary consideration, even a potential liability, for several carefully calculated reasons. Naval aviators like Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto, stationed at Buin on Bougainville, explained the underlying logic in detailed combat reports preserved in Japanese naval archives. An aircraft that cannot turn is an aircraft that cannot choose its engagements in combat. The Americans possessed faster fighters, undeniably so, but if they could not force Japanese pilots into their preferred kind of fight, their speed became tactically irrelevant. Speed without maneuverability was like a sword too heavy to swing, impressive in theory, useless in practice. This reasoning had proved devastatingly sound against the F-4F Wildcat for nearly 2 years. American pilots in Wildcats had learned the harsh lesson that they couldn't dogfight Zeros and survive. The tactical solution they'd developed, formations like the Thach Weave, defensive mutual support, hit-and-run diving attacks, was effective for survival, but not for achieving air superiority. It was the tactic of an overmatched opponent, making the best of inferior equipment. Zero pilots had adapted by using altitude advantage to choose when to engage, breaking off cleanly when Americans attempted to force diving engagements. The tactical balance had stabilized into a pattern that favored Japanese fighters. Americans could survive through disciplined defensive tactics, but Japanese pilots retained the crucial ability to disengage at will and fundamentally control the terms of engagement. When briefing pilots about the Corsair, Japanese intelligence officers at Rabaul emphasized that the new American fighter appeared to be simply a faster, more powerful version of the same basic problem they'd been successfully managing for 2 years. One briefing document noted with clinical precision, "They have substantially more engine power, but their aircraft remains too heavy for sustained maneuvering combat." Our fundamental tactical advantages persist unchanged. Standard doctrine remains effective. What Japanese analysts failed to grasp, what their doctrinal framework and cultural assumptions made nearly impossible to recognize, was that the Corsair represented not merely incremental improvement in an existing design philosophy, but a fundamental shift in what fighter aircraft could accomplish when engine power reached a critical threshold. The Americans hadn't just built a faster Wildcat, they'd built something that would rewrite the physics of aerial combat. The stage was set for one of the swiftest and most complete reversals of tactical advantage in aviation history. Japanese pilots who had dominated Pacific skies for 18 months were about to discover that their assumptions, their training, their hard-won tactical knowledge, and even their superior skill were becoming irrelevant against an opponent who had changed what kind of war aerial combat would be. The whistling sound was coming, and nothing in Japanese doctrine could prepare them for what it meant. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 124, operating from Guadalcanal under Major William E. Giese, began flying combat air patrols and bomber escort missions in their new Corsairs throughout April 1943. The squadron's pilots were experienced but not elite by Japanese standards. Most had between 300 and 500 flight hours before entering combat, significantly less than their Japanese opponents who averaged 650 to 800 hours. What they did have was an aircraft that was about to fundamentally rewrite the rules of Pacific air combat in ways that neither side fully anticipated. April 13, 1943. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh led a division of 4 Corsairs on an escort mission for bombers attacking Japanese positions on Munda Airfield in the Central Solomons. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for aerial combat. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Walsh's division spotted an enemy formation at 15,000 feet, roughly 3,000 feet above the American aircraft. 15 Zeros in a loose combat spread, exactly the kind of engagement Japanese pilots had dominated for 2 years. The Zero pilots began their typical tactical approach, a diving turn to engage from superior altitude, the maneuver that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots who couldn't match the Zero's combination of dive speed and turning ability. Standard Japanese doctrine, executed by experienced pilots who had performed this maneuver successfully dozens of times. Walsh later described what happened next in his combat report with the clinical precision that characterized marine aviation documentation. He spotted the enemy formation at 15,000 feet, approximately 3,000 above his division's altitude. The Japanese aircraft began their characteristic diving turn to engage. Walsh pushed his throttle to full military power and initiated a climbing turn to meet them head-on. What happened in the next 30 seconds violated everything Japanese tactical doctrine assumed about American fighters. The Corsair's massive R2-800 engine delivering 2,000 horsepower through a massive 13-foot diameter propeller provided performance that shocked the Japanese pilots encountering it for the first time. Walsh's Corsair didn't just climb to meet the diving Zeros. It accelerated while climbing at angles that should have stalled any fighter attempting such a maneuver. The physics seemed impossible. Heavy fighters couldn't maintain speed in steep climbing turns. Every principle of aircraft performance that Japanese pilots had learned, every tactical assumption they'd validated through years of combat, said this couldn't happen. But it was happening. Walsh continued his report with matter-of-fact language that concealed the revolutionary nature of what he was describing. He met the lead Zero head-on in his climbing turn. The Japanese pilot attempted his standard defensive brake turn, the maneuver that had saved countless Zero pilots by forcing heavier American fighters to overshoot. But Walsh's Corsair stayed with the Zero through 3/4 of his turn, maintaining position and firing solution. Walsh fired a 2-second burst from his 650 caliber machine guns, 12 guns total between the Corsair's wings, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. The Zero disintegrated. The concentrated firepower from those 12 50 caliber guns, each round weighing nearly 2 ounces and travelling at over 2,800 feet per second, literally tore the lighter Japanese aircraft apart. The Zero's structural philosophy prioritized weight reduction for maneuverability and range. It sacrificed armor protection and structural reinforcement. Against the Corsair's firepower, those design choices became fatal liabilities. Walsh shot down 3 Zeros in that engagement, each kill following the same impossible pattern, the Corsair matching turns that should have been unmatchable, maintaining speed that should have bled away, delivering firepower that shredded the lighter Japanese aircraft. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Harold Spears, destroyed 2 more Zeros using identical tactics. The remaining Japanese fighters broke off the engagement and fled. This violated every principle of Japanese tactical doctrine and warrior culture. Japanese pilots didn't retreat from inferior opponents. They pressed attacks with aggressive determination, accepting casualties to achieve kills. But 5 Zeros had been destroyed in less than 3 minutes, and the American fighters were still maintaining formation, still capable of continuing the fight. The surviving Japanese pilots returned to their base at Munda with combat reports that their commanders initially refused to believe. American fighters that could climb while turning at impossible angles. American fighters that could match Zero maneuverability at high speeds. It contradicted 2 years of validated combat experience. It made no sense. But the wreckage of 5 Zeros told a different story than Japanese doctrine wanted to hear. The technical reality of what Japanese intelligence had missed was more profound than any single combat engagement could reveal. The Corsair wasn't just a more powerful aircraft, it was a fighter designed around principles that Japanese aviation had systematically underestimated. While Zero designers had prioritized extreme maneuverability and operational range by minimizing every possible ounce of weight, the A6M Zero weighed approximately 5,300 pounds empty. Corsair designers had pursued a radically different philosophy. The F4U's empty weight exceeded 8,900 pounds, nearly 70% heavier than a Zero. Japanese analysts had viewed this weight as confirmation of American engineering crudeness, proof that American designers lacked the refinement and discipline to create truly efficient aircraft. What they failed to calculate, and what their assumptions about aircraft performance made nearly impossible to grasp, was how that 2,000 horsepower engine altered every equation that governed fighter combat. The Corsair's maximum speed exceeded 415 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, roughly 80 miles per hour faster than the Zero's maximum speed of 335 miles per hour. But maximum speed in level flight was almost irrelevant compared to the truly revolutionary characteristic. The Corsair could maintain high speeds in climbs and sustained turns that would force a Zero to bleed energy catastrophically. The American fighter's rate of climb exceeded 2,800 feet per minute, matching or exceeding the Zero's climb performance, while simultaneously carrying 650 caliber machine guns with 2,400 rounds of ammunition firepower that could see a Zero in half with a 1-second burst. First, Lieutenant Archie Donahue, another VMF-124 pilot who would eventually achieve 14 confirmed kills, described what these performance characteristics meant in practical combat terms. The Japanese kept trying to turn-fight American Corsairs using their traditional tactics. What they didn't realize, what their tactical doctrine couldn't accommodate, was that the Corsair could use overwhelming speed to dictate engagement ranges and timing. American pilots could climb as fast as Japanese fighters could climb, match their turns at high speed where the Corsair's power overcame its weight disadvantage, then extend away at will when they wanted to disengage. The Japanese couldn't catch fleeing Corsairs, and they couldn't shake Corsairs that chose to pursue. The fundamental ability to control engagement terms, the core advantage that had defined Japanese air superiority for 2 years, had been reversed. By late May 1943, 5 Marine Corsair squadrons were operating from Henderson Field and fighter strips throughout the Solomon Islands. The cumulative kill ratio was beginning to reveal a pattern that Japanese commanders found increasingly difficult to explain, rationalize, or counter through tactical adjustments. VMF 124 alone had destroyed 37 Japanese aircraft by the end of May, while losing only 2 Corsairs to enemy fighters. Several Corsairs had been lost to anti-aircraft fire and operational accidents, but in pure fighter versus fighter combat, the ratio was approaching 20-1. VMF 213, the Hellhawks squadron, achieved nearly identical results. VMF 221 recorded even more lopsided statistics: 41 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 0 Corsairs lost to enemy fighters. These weren't isolated incidents or statistical anomalies. This was a systematic reversal of aerial combat advantage happening across the entire Solomon Islands theatre. Lieutenant Masajiro Kawato, a Zero pilot stationed at Rabaul with over 400 hours of combat experience, survived his first encounter with Corsairs in late May 1943. His post-war account, recorded in interviews conducted by American military historians in the 1950s, describes the psychological shock of that engagement with vivid, unsettling detail. Kawato engaged what he initially identified as another American fighter diving from altitude, a standard tactical situation he'd successfully handled dozens of times. He executed a sharp turn at the moment the American fighter committed to its attack, the defensive maneuver that had saved his life in previous combats against Wildcats. He expected the heavy American aircraft to overshoot his turn, exposing itself to counterattack, as its momentum carried it past him. But this aircraft, the one making that terrible, distinctive whistling sound as air screamed through its oil coolers, stayed with his turn. The Corsair's speed barely decreased, even as it matched Kawato's turning radius. Kawato reversed his turn sharply, a desperate maneuver attempting to force the American pilot into a mistake, to create even a momentary opening for escape or counterattack. The Corsair reversed with him instantly, smoothly, and Kawato could see the American fighter's guns tracking him with mechanical precision. Only by pushing his Zero into a near-vertical dive and using terrain masking, flying below hilltops to break visual contact, did Kawato manage to escape. He returned to Rabaul badly shaken, his aircraft untouched but his confidence shattered. His debriefing report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, noted with unusual candor, "This new American fighter combines speed with maneuverability in ways that fundamentally violate our tactical assumptions. It can engage us in sustained turning combat at high speed and disengage before we can respond effectively. Immediate tactical revision is urgently recommended." But tactical revision required acknowledging that fundamental assumptions about American fighters' assumptions validated by 2 years of successful combat had been catastrophically wrong. Such admission contradicted Japanese institutional culture and military doctrine in ways that made genuine adaptation extraordinarily difficult. June 16, 1943. The engagement over the Russell Islands crystallized the Corsair's dominance in a way that Japanese commanders could no longer rationalize as isolated incidents, pilot error, or temporary circumstances. 54 Japanese aircraft, a mixed formation of 24 Zero fighters escorting 30 D-3A Val dive bombers, approached Allied shipping near the Russell Islands in what should have been a standard attack mission. American radar detected the formation approximately 70 miles out, providing ample warning time. 24 Corsairs from VMF 124, VMF 213, and VMF 221 scrambled to intercept. The resulting engagement would be studied in military aviation schools for decades. First Lieutenant James Swett of VMF 221, flying his Corsair with full ammunition load and external fuel tanks still attached, intercepted the Japanese formation at 18,000 feet. His after-action report provides clinical detail that conceals the extraordinary nature of what he accomplished in the next 15 minutes. Swett approached the enemy formation from superior altitude, having climbed rapidly to gain the decisive advantage that Japanese fighters had exploited for 2 years. He dove through the Zero fighter screen at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, faster than the Zeros could react or maneuver to intercept. He engaged 2 Zeros in a high-speed passing attack, destroying both before the Japanese pilots could execute defensive maneuvers. The engagement happened so quickly that the other Japanese fighters couldn't effectively respond. Sweat continued through the Zero screen to the dive bomber formation behind it. He engaged 7 Val dive bombers in sequence, destroying all 7 before exhausting his ammunition. The entire engagement, from first contact to final kill, lasted approximately 15 minutes. Sweat had destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft single-handedly. He would receive the Medal of Honor for this action, though his achievement, while extraordinary, was part of a larger pattern that day that revealed the Corsair's systematic dominance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 24 Corsairs destroyed 31 Japanese aircraft, 17 Zeros and 14 Val bombers, while losing precisely 1 Corsair to anti-aircraft fire from a Japanese destroyer. Not a single Corsair was destroyed by enemy fighters. The kill ratio for that engagement was effectively 31-0 in fighter versus fighter combat. Japanese commanders at Rabaul faced an intelligence crisis that their institutional framework made nearly impossible to resolve. Combat reports from surviving pilots consistently described an American fighter that violated every principle their understanding of aircraft design was built upon. Heavy fighters couldn't turn effectively. This was aerodynamic law, validated by years of engineering analysis and combat experience. Maneuverable fighters couldn't carry heavy firepower without sacrificing performance. This was basic physics of weight and power ratios. Fast fighters bled energy catastrophically in climbs and sustained turns. This was thermodynamics and momentum conservation. Yet the Corsair appeared to violate all these principles simultaneously, consistently, and overwhelmingly. Captain Okumiya at Rabaul struggled to reconcile combat reports with technical analysis. The reports were undeniable, dozens of experienced pilots describing the same impossible performance characteristics. But the technical analysis said such performance was impossible given the Corsair's known weight and dimensions. Something in their fundamental understanding of fighter aircraft design had to be wrong. But acknowledging that meant acknowledging that 2 years of tactical doctrine had been built on flawed assumptions. The Japanese response took 2 parallel forms that reflected deep institutional tension between adapting to reality and preserving doctrinal consistency. Tactically, pilots received revised instructions: avoid engagement with Corsairs below 20,000 feet, where the American fighters' power-to-weight ratio provided decisive advantages. Maintain altitude superiority and engage only when Corsairs were separated from formations and couldn't provide mutual support. Execute single firing passes and immediately disengage rather than attempting sustained maneuvering combat. These instructions effectively conceded air superiority at medium and low altitudes, precisely where most combat air patrol and ground attack missions occurred. They transformed Japanese fighter doctrine from aggressive dominance to cautious survival. But many Japanese pilots, particularly veterans with dozens of kills, resisted these tactical changes. They believed that superior training, warrior spirit, and aggressive determination could overcome mere mechanical advantage. This cultural resistance to accepting that skill alone couldn't compensate for overwhelming technical superiority cost Japanese naval aviation irreplaceable veteran pilots throughout the summer of 1943. Lieutenant Nishizawa, Japan's leading ace who would eventually be credited with over 87 victories, demonstrated both the potential and the danger of this mindset in a combat report from July 12, 1943. He engaged an F4U fighter in turning combat at medium altitude, precisely what revised doctrine warned against. Initially, Nishizawa matched the Corsair's turns by accepting dangerously high angles of attack and lower speeds, using his exceptional skill to extract maximum performance from his Zero. For approximately 30 seconds, he maintained position. Then the Corsair pilot applied full power and accelerated, while maintaining turn radius, a maneuver that should have been physically impossible for any aircraft. The Corsair simply powered through the turn, speed increasing rather than decreasing, and Nishizawa found himself suddenly defensive, his Zero unable to match performance that violated every principle of energy management he'd been taught. Nishizawa survived only because his extraordinary skill allowed him to recognize the moment when continued engagement meant certain death. He broke off, diving away, and using his Zero's slightly superior low-speed handling to evade the Corsair's pursuit among cloud cover. Less experienced pilots, convinced that determination and proper technique could overcome technical disadvantage, continued pressing engagements they couldn't win. The veteran pilot corps that had given Japanese naval aviation its decisive edge was being methodically destroyed in a war of attrition against opponents who combined numerical superiority with decisive technical advantage. By the end of September 1943, exactly 6 months after the Corsair's combat introduction, Marine Aviation Headquarters had compiled comprehensive combat statistics. The numbers documented a shift in aerial warfare that would influence fighter aircraft design philosophy for decades and effectively end Japanese naval aviation as a dominant force in the Pacific War. Marine Corsair squadrons operating in the Solomon Islands had destroyed 584 Japanese aircraft, while losing 53 Corsairs to all causes enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, operational accidents, and ground attacks on airfields. Of those 53 losses, only 27 were attributable directly to Japanese fighters in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio against enemy fighters was 11.6 to 1. To understand the profound significance of this ratio, context matters critically. The F4F Wildcat, which the Corsair was systematically replacing in Marine squadrons, had achieved approximately 6.9 to 1 throughout its service life, a respectable ratio that reflects sound tactics, adequate training, and pilot determination, making the best of equipment limitations. The P-51 Mustang, eventually recognized as perhaps the finest fighter aircraft of the European theater, would achieve roughly 8 to 1 in combat against the Luftwaffe. The Corsair's 11 to 1 ratio in its first 6 months of combat operations represented a quantum leap in fighter effectiveness that had no parallel in aviation history to that point. Major Marion Carl, one of the Corsair's most successful pilots with 18.5 confirmed kills by war's end, explained why the ratio wasn't simply about raw aircraft performance in isolation. The Corsair gave American pilots the tool to fully exploit the tactical development they'd undergone through 2 years of bitter learning against superior opponents. American pilots had learned from fighting Zeros the hard way: don't attempt dogfighting, use speed and altitude advantages, coordinate attacks, maintain mutual support, and never fight alone. The Wildcat could survive using these tactics through disciplined execution and accepting limitations. The Corsair could dominate using these tactics because it removed the limitations that had constrained American fighter pilots since Pearl Harbor. But for Japanese pilots facing Corsairs daily across the Solomon Islands, the experience represented a complete inversion of their tactical reality and psychological understanding of aerial combat. What had been their decisive advantages, extreme maneuverability, superbly trained pilots, aggressive warrior spirit doctrine had become irrelevant or even actively counterproductive against an opponent who could choose when to fight, how to fight, and when to disengage. The control of engagement terms that had defined air superiority had been decisively, permanently reversed. Lieutenant Kawato's experience through late 1943 tracked the broader transformation of Japanese fighter tactics from aggressive confidence to desperate survival. His combat diary, recovered and translated after the war, provides remarkable insight into how individual pilots processed the tactical revolution occurring around them with devastating psychological impact. June 1943. The whistling death appears in every engagement now. Our superior training should overcome their mechanical advantages, but pilots are disappearing faster than replacement crews can arrive from Japan. August 1943. Standard turning engagement no longer viable against F4U aircraft. Must use altitude advantage and numerical superiority. Our newer pilots lack the experience to execute these complex tactics successfully. We lose them within their first 5 combat sorties. October 1943. We are hunted now. The Americans patrol with absolute impunity. Our role has become survival rather than air superiority. I no longer recognize the air war I was trained for. Everything we were taught has become obsolete. Kawato survived the war, flying from Rabaul until its isolation and containment in early 1944, then serving as a flight instructor in Japan proper, where the diminishing fuel supplies barely allowed training flights. In extensive post-war interviews conducted for American military history projects, he described the profound psychological impact of the tactical reversal with remarkable candor. Japanese naval aviators had been taught that fighting spirit and superior training would always prevail over material advantage. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was doctrine based on Japan's successful experience in China and the early Pacific campaigns. The Corsair taught a generation of Japanese pilots that modern industrial warfare had become fundamentally a contest of engineering capacity and production capability. Japan had excelled at creating what seemed to be the perfect fighter for the war they expected to fight in 1941. America had created the fighter that changed what kind of war it would actually be and had the industrial capacity to produce it in overwhelming numbers. By October 1943, even the propaganda apparatus that had contributed to Japanese pilot overconfidence began acknowledging the Corsair's impact in ways that revealed deeper cultural confrontation with unwelcome reality. Tokyo Rose, the collective name for English-speaking female broadcasters on Japanese propaganda radio transmissions, had initially mocked the Corsair throughout spring 1943 as the broken-wing fighter rejected by your own Navy. The broadcasts were designed to demoralize American servicemen by highlighting apparent American military incompetence and equipment failures. By autumn 1943, the propaganda broadcasts had changed tone dramatically. Tokyo Rose now warned American servicemen that the whistling death had been marked for special attention by Japan's finest. Remaining pilots, an implicit acknowledgement that the aircraft required such attention, that it had become a threat significant enough to warrant specific countermeasures. The shift from mockery to grudging acknowledgement revealed more than Japanese propagandists likely intended. Japanese newspapers, while maintaining optimistic reporting about the Pacific War's progress for domestic consumption, began referring to the Corsair with terminology that showed reluctant respect, barely concealing growing dread. Articles described it as the bent-wing demon, and noted that it combined American industrial excess with unexpected fighting capability, language that tried to maintain ideological criticism while acknowledging technical reality. More significantly, Japanese naval aviation began implementing systematic tactical changes that explicitly conceded the Corsair's superiority in most combat scenarios. Training directives issued from Naval Air Headquarters in late 1943 instructed pilots to avoid engagement with Corsairs unless holding significant altitude advantage at least 5,000 feet and numerical superiority of at least 3-1. When engagement became unavoidable, pilots were instructed to make a single high-speed firing pass and immediately disengage using speed in a dive, rather than attempting any form of sustained maneuvering combat. These directives essentially abandoned the aggressive, maneuver-oriented doctrine that had defined Japanese naval aviation since its inception. It represented an extraordinary transformation forced by an aircraft that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as crude American engineering excess just months earlier. The Corsair's 11-to-1 kill ratio in its first 6 months created strategic consequences that cascaded far beyond individual air battles and cumulative statistics. By establishing overwhelming American air superiority throughout the Solomon Islands, Corsairs enabled the island-hopping campaign strategy that would isolate and neutralize major Japanese bases without requiring direct costly assaults. Rabaul, the massive Japanese base complex with over 100,000 troops, extensive fortifications, and 5 operational airfields, became untenable as an effective military installation by early 1944 due to repeated bombing raids by American aircraft escorted by Corsairs that Japanese fighters could no longer effectively contest. Captain Okumiya described the situation in his post-war memoir with bitter clarity. "Our fighters could no longer effectively defend our own airspace over our own primary base. American bombers, escorted by Corsairs, could attack our installations essentially at will. We became spectators to our own systematic defeat, watching our capability to resist erode daily while unable to prevent it." The loss of air superiority prevented Japanese air forces from supporting ground troops during American amphibious landings at Bougainville, New Georgia, Vella Lavella, and other islands throughout the Solomons. Ground campaigns that might have been prolonged, bloody defensive struggles. Japanese forces were formidable in prepared defensive positions, instead became relatively swift American victories because Japanese ground forces fought without effective air support, while American ground forces enjoyed complete air dominance, enabling close air support and interrupting Japanese supply lines. The strategic transformation came at extraordinary and ultimately irreplaceable human cost to Japanese naval aviation. The veteran pilot corps that had begun the war with such exceptional skill and justified confidence was systematically destroyed through attrition against technically superior opponents like the Corsair throughout 1943 and 44. By the end of 1943, most of Japan's finest aces had been killed in combat or severely wounded. Lieutenant Nishizawa survived through 1944, but was killed when his transport aircraft was ambushed and shot down by American fighters, dying as a passenger rather than in aerial combat, an ignoble end for Japan's highest-scoring ace. Lieutenant Sakai had been catastrophically wounded in August 1942 when a rear gunner's bullet destroyed his right eye and caused severe head trauma. He returned to limited combat duties through sheer determination, but never regained his pre-injury effectiveness or the confident, aggressive style that had made him legendary. The systematic destruction of experienced pilots, each requiring 600 to 800 hours of intensive training that Japan could no longer provide, given fuel shortages and attrition rates, created a death spiral in Japanese aviation capability. By mid-1944, newly graduated Japanese pilots entered combat with approximately 200 to 275 hours of total flight time, less than half the training their predecessors had received. American pilots in the same period averaged 325 to 450 hours, still less than early war Japanese pilots. But flying aircraft like the Corsair that had such overwhelming technical superiority that pilot skill gaps became almost irrelevant. American pilot First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, flying Corsairs with VMF-215, shot down 20 Japanese aircraft in just 17 combat days during January 1944. His remarkable success was partly due to his own exceptional skill and aggressive tactics, but equally reflected the catastrophic decline in Japanese pilot quality and aircraft capability. Hansen encountered increasingly inexperienced Japanese pilots flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training, insufficient fuel for proper practice, and deteriorating maintenance due to parts shortages. Hansen himself would be killed in action on February 3, 1944, shot down by anti-aircraft fire during a low-level strafing attack. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His brief, brilliant career illustrated both the Corsair's dominance and the continuing danger of combat, even against a weakening opponent. In a final historical irony, that Japanese intelligence officers at Rabaul would have found bitterly appropriate. The United States Navy, which had rejected the Corsair for carrier operations in early 1943 due to landing difficulties and visibility problems, reversed its decision in November 1943. Technical modifications to cockpit design and canopy configuration had addressed visibility issues. Changes to landing gear, oleos, and pilot training procedures had resolved the dangerous bouncing tendency during carrier landings. More significantly, the aircraft's extraordinary combat performance made the Navy unwilling to continue fielding inferior fighters on fleet carriers, while Marine squadrons achieved such overwhelming success with Corsairs from land bases. The Navy's institutional pride couldn't accept that Marines were flying superior equipment. The Navy's first carrier-based Corsair squadron, VF-17 Jolly Rogers, under Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, officially deployed to the Solomon Islands aboard USS Bunker Hill in September 1943, though they primarily operated from land bases initially. By early 1944, Corsairs began regular carrier operations from fleet carriers, eventually serving on dozens of carriers through the war's end. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had mocked as rejected by their own Navy had proved so devastatingly effective that the Navy reversed its rejection and would eventually purchase over 12,000 Corsairs, the longest production run of any piston-engine fighter aircraft in American history. Corsairs remained in production until 1952, serving in the Korean War and in foreign air forces into the 1960s. After the war, surviving Japanese naval aviators and aeronautical engineers conducted extensive analysis attempting to understand why their assessments of American aircraft capability had proved so catastrophically wrong. The effort wasn't merely academic, it represented an attempt to understand how their institutional framework and cultural assumptions had led to such profound miscalculation. Former Captain Okumiya, in his 1956 book Examining Japanese Naval Aviation's Failure, wrote with remarkable candor that would have been impossible during the war. We made the fundamental error of believing that what had worked successfully would necessarily continue to work. The Zero's design philosophy was absolutely correct for the war we expected to fight in 1941, but we failed to understand that the Americans would not continue fighting that war on our terms indefinitely. The Corsair represented American willingness to solve problems through engineering, innovation, and industrial capacity rather than accepting limitations as permanent constraints. We built the perfect fighter for our doctrine. They built a fighter that made our doctrine obsolete. Horikoshi Jiro, the brilliant engineer who designed the Zero, offered a more technical assessment in post-war interviews that acknowledged the fundamental constraint Japan faced. The Corsair's performance came from accepting weight and structural complexity that Japanese designers had rejected as incompatible with carrier operations and the requirement for extended range. The Americans proved that sufficient engine power could overcome weight penalties, but that required engines like the R2800 that Japan's industrial base couldn't manufacture in quantity. More critically, operating such aircraft required fuel supplies that Japan's increasingly disrupted logistics network couldn't sustain. This final point revealed perhaps the most fundamental constraint. The Corsair's R2800 engine consumed approximately 75 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel per hour at military power, roughly twice the Zero's fuel consumption rate. Japan's fuel supply, increasingly strangled by American submarine warfare against tanker traffic, made operating such fuel-intensive aircraft operationally unsustainable, even if Japanese industry could have manufactured them. American industrial and resource superiority had created a situation where Japan couldn't effectively counter American technical solutions even after understanding their principles. The story of how the F4U Corsair transformed from mocked reject to whistling death, achieving an 11-to-1 kill ratio in just 6 months, reveals one of the Pacific War's most profound ironies. In modern industrial warfare, the side that adapts its assumptions to accommodate reality survives and prevails, while the side that attempts to force reality to conform to existing assumptions perishes regardless of skill, courage, or determination. Japanese naval aviation had built its doctrine and institutional culture around assumptions that had proved devastatingly correct from 1941 through early 1943. Light, supremely maneuverable fighters flown by exceptionally trained pilots employing aggressive tactics could dominate heavier, less agile opponents through superior tactics and warrior determination. These assumptions weren't arbitrary cultural prejudices or propaganda. They were carefully reasoned conclusions drawn from years of combat experience and validated by hundreds of successful engagements. But assumptions that survive contact with one opponent may fail catastrophically against an opponent who fundamentally changes the nature of combat itself. The Corsair didn't defeat the Zero by fighting the war the Zero was designed for. It changed what kind of warfighter combat would be, transforming aerial combat from a contest of maneuverability and pilot skill into a contest of energy management, speed, overwhelming firepower, and industrial capacity to replace losses. The 6 months from April to September 1943 marked one of the swiftest and most complete transformations in aerial warfare history. Japanese pilots who began that period supremely confident in their tactical superiority ended it hunted in their own airspace, unable to defend their bases, unable to support their ground forces, watching their experienced pilots disappear faster than inadequately trained replacements could arrive. The broken-wing fighter had become the weapon that systematically broke Japanese air power across the Pacific theater. For Lieutenant Kawato and thousands of other Japanese pilots who survived the war, the Corsair's distinctive whistling sound, air screaming through oil coolers at high speed, became an auditory symbol of a larger, more painful truth they had been forced to learn through devastating experience. In modern industrial warfare, superior tactics, and warrior spirit operating within severe resource constraints ultimately cannot defeat superior engineering capability backed by overwhelming industrial capacity and secure resource supply. It was a lesson learned too late, purchased at the cost of an entire generation of irreplaceable pilots and the air superiority that might have extended Japan's ability to resist by years. The Americans had taken an aircraft their own navy had initially rejected as unsuitable for carrier operations and transformed it into perhaps the most successful fighter of the Pacific War. Final statistics by war's end in 1945 told the story with numerical finality. Corsairs achieved 2,140 confirmed air-to-air kills against 189. Corsairs lost to enemy aircraft, an overall kill ratio of 11.3 to 1 that has never been exceeded by any fighter aircraft in conventional aerial combat throughout aviation history. The whistling death had spoken its final verdict on Japanese assumptions about fighter combat, and that whistle, still heard when preserved Corsairs fly at airshows today, remains a sound that once meant certain doom to pilots who learned, far too late, that mockery provides no defense against engineering excellence married to industrial supremacy. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.